It is shortly after 5 in the morning Greenwich Mean Time. Over the North Atlantic, more than halfway between Canada and Portugal, an Airbus A330 slices through the darkness at 39,000 feet. Outside, there is only an endless black sky and the faint shimmer of moonlight on clouds thousands of feet below. Inside, most of the passengers are asleep. The cabin lights are dim, and the hum of the twin Rolls-Royce engines fills the background. Steady, familiar, reassuring. Then, without warning, that hum stops. The change is immediate and absolute. The deep vibration that had pulsed through the floor disappears. The sound that defines flight, the steady thrum of thrust, is gone. In its place is a hollow quiet broken only by the faint rush of wind over the fuselage. Seconds later, the lights flicker and die. Emergency lighting snaps on. The cabin glows faintly orange. From above the seats, oxygen masks drop with mechanical clicks, swinging from their cords in the weightless air. For a moment, there is confusion rather than panic. Many passengers think it is turbulence or a routine power reset. But when the masks fall, instinct takes over. Mothers pull them onto their children's faces. Others fumble in half-sleep. The flight attendants shout instructions, but their voices are muffled through the masks. In the cockpit, the atmosphere shifts from routine to disbelief. Both engine pressure gauges have dropped to zero. Warnings fill the electronic display screens. The ECAM, the aircraft's central alert system, flashes messages faster than they can be read. English 1 fail. English 2 fail. Elec gen off. Captain Robert Pish grips the side stick, scanning the instruments that still function. Beside him, First Officer Dirk de Jager calls out altitude and airspeed. Both men know what the readings mean. Both engines have flamed out. Their Airbus, weighing more than 200 tons, is now a glider. The cockpit is illuminated by the faint glow of emergency screens. Outside the windshield, there is nothing but darkness. They are at 33,000 feet and descending silently. Pish calls for the dual engine failure checklist. The first item flashes on screen. Start APU. De Jager reaches up to the overhead panel, presses the switch, and waits. The auxiliary power unit, a small turbine in the tail, tries to start, but with no fuel pressure it cannot ignite. The cockpit falls silent again. Now, another system deploys automatically, the ram air turbine, known as the RAT. A small propeller drops from a compartment under the fuselage, spinning in the airstream. Its movement generates just enough power to supply the captain's basic flight instruments and hydraulic control to the main surfaces. The rest of the airplane remains dark and powerless. In the cabin, the silence is eerie. Passengers can hear the creaking of metal and the whoosh of wind over the skin of the aircraft, sounds normally drowned out by engines. Some whisper prayers. Others grip the seats in front of them. Through the windows, faint stars glint above the wing, and somewhere below, unseen in the black, lies the Atlantic Ocean. The captain looks to his instruments. Airspeed, 210 knots. Altitude, 31,000 feet and falling. Distance to Lodges Airport on the Azores, their intended diversion field, more than 100 kilometers. The math is grim. A heavy jet like the A330 can glide roughly 2 nautical miles for every 1,000 feet of altitude. At their current height, that gives them a theoretical range of about 62 miles, just barely enough under perfect conditions to reach land. But nothing about this situation is perfect. The aircraft is not designed for silent flight. Hydraulic pressure is weak. Trim control is limited. The electrical systems are fading. Each minute they remain in the air, their options narrow. De Jager radios Santa Maria Air Traffic Control, the nearest facility covering this stretch of ocean. Mayday, 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 he begins. Air Transat 236, dual engine failure. We are gliding toward Lodges. Static answers back. Then the controller's voice, calm, distant, confirming the emergency and clearing all other traffic. In the tower at Lodges, air controllers and rescue crews are alerted. The fire brigade rolls toward the runway. The approach lights are turned on, their glow visible for miles. A faint beacon on a small island in a vast sea. Back in the cockpit, the captain focuses on conserving altitude. Every decision now matters. He adjusts pitch to maintain the best glide speed, 220 knots. Too slow and the aircraft will stall. Too fast and it will lose altitude too quickly. There is no room for error. Behind the locked cockpit door, the cabin crew prepare passengers for an emergency ditching. Instructions are shouted in both English and Portuguese. Passengers are told to tighten seatbelts, remove sharp objects, and brace for impact. Many are crying quietly, but the attendants remain composed, following the same training that has been drilled for years, though few ever expect to use it. Minutes pass. The descent continues. At 25,000 feet, the crew can see the faint horizon lighten, dawn approaching. Clouds below glow faintly silver. The airplane remains stable, gliding smoothly through the night air. The captain's mind is fixed on a single question. How much farther can they stretch the glide? He calculates in his head, cross-checking against the distance remaining to lodges. It will be close. Too close. The cockpit voice recorder captures few words between the two men now. Most of their communication is instinctive, short, clipped confirmations. Speed, 210. Check. Pitch -2. Copy. Outside, the Atlantic remains invisible. But they know what awaits if they fall short. Waves several meters high, total darkness, and no chance of rescue before dawn. At 15,000 feet, Pish makes a decision. They will continue gliding to the island. He will not attempt a ditching. The RAT continues to spin, whining faintly in the wind. Electrical power is minimal but stable. The attitude indicator shows they are level, wings steady. Ahead, the navigation display shows a single waypoint, lodges. In the cabin, a few passengers notice something new, a faint glow on the horizon. Someone whispers that they can see lights. Word spreads quietly row to row. For the first time in half an hour, hope replaces silence. But for the crew, the hardest part is still ahead. They are too high to land directly, and without engines, they have no thrust to correct their path once committed. Every turn, every descent angle must be exact. The captain takes a slow breath. "Let's keep her flying," he says quietly. In the tower, the controller watches the radar screen. A faint blip appears at the outer edge, moving steadily closer. He steps outside for a moment and scans the dark horizon. Far off, a single blinking light appears, the navigation strobe of a powerless Airbus, gliding silently toward him. 293 passengers, 13 crew, 33,000 feet of altitude falling fast. No engines, no thrust, no second chances. What led one of the world's safest aircraft to become a powerless glider over open water? It was the evening of August 23, 2001. At Toronto's Pearson International Airport, Air Transat Flight 236 was preparing for departure. The flight, scheduled to cross the North Atlantic overnight to Lisbon, Portugal, was a regular route for the Canadian Leisure Airline. A 7-hour journey covering nearly 3,800 miles. The weather that evening was calm. The skies over Toronto were clear, and temperatures were mild. Ideal conditions for a long-haul flight. Inside the departure terminal, a mix of languages could be heard: English, French, and Portuguese. Some passengers were chatting about their upcoming holidays. Others were simply eager to return home. In total, 293 passengers and 13 crew members boarded the Airbus A330-200 assigned to Flight 236. Most were holidaymakers, families, couples, and groups of friends heading to Portugal's beaches and southern resorts. Among them were also Portuguese nationals living in Canada, traveling home for summer visits with relatives. For many, it was a routine journey, a comfortable red-eye flight that would land them in Lisbon by morning. At the gate, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. The aircraft, tail number CGITS, gleamed under the terminal lights. It had entered service just 2 years earlier and was one of the more modern jets in Air Transat's fleet. Once boarding was complete, the doors were closed and the flight crew began final preparations. The flight plan called for a cruising altitude of 39,000 feet, following a standard Great Circle route over the North Atlantic. The total flight time was expected to be around 7 hours, with fuel reserves comfortably above regulatory minimums. In total, the plane carried 48 metric tons of fuel, enough for the flight to Lisbon, plus diversion options if needed. For Air Transat, this was business as usual. The airline, founded in 1986, had built a strong reputation as a safe and reliable carrier specializing in transatlantic leisure travel. By 2001, it operated a modern fleet of wide-body aircraft and carried millions of passengers annually between Canada and Europe. While not a major global airline, its maintenance and operational standards met the same regulatory benchmarks as larger carriers. In the days before the flight, the aircraft had undergone routine maintenance, including a recent engine inspection. Records showed no irregularities or deferred defects. Both engines, Rolls-Royce Trent 772s, were operating within normal parameters. The flight crew for this journey, Captain Robert Pish and First Officer Dirk de Jager, were well-rested and experienced. Both had arrived at the airport earlier that afternoon to review weather reports and flight documentation. They found nothing unusual in the forecast. The route across the Atlantic was expected to be clear and uneventful, with minimal turbulence and no significant storm activity. By 8:45 p.m. local time, boarding was complete. Passengers settled into their seats. The cabin crew conducted safety briefings, and the aircraft doors were secured. At 9 p.m., the A330 pushed back from gate C1. As the engines spooled up and the aircraft taxied toward runway 24, few on board would have imagined that this routine flight was about to enter aviation history. After a short wait for clearance, Flight 236 accelerated down the runway and lifted into the night sky over Toronto. Below, the city lights stretched like a golden web before fading into darkness as the aircraft climbed eastward over the Atlantic. The first officer set the autopilot, and the climb continued smoothly toward cruise altitude. Inside the cockpit, the flight deck was quiet. The pilots monitored instruments, made standard position reports, and checked systems as the A330 settled into its rhythm. Outside, the sky was cloudless, the kind of smooth night flight that crews often describe as uneventful. In the passenger cabin, lights dimmed as meals were served. Some passengers watched movies. Others reclined their seats to sleep. The cabin crew moved quietly through the aisles, checking seatbelts and distributing blankets. For all on board, it was just another night flight across the ocean, calm, comfortable, and predictable. But hidden within one of the aircraft's engines was a tiny mechanical vulnerability, a part installed incorrectly during recent maintenance. No one on board knew that a single misplaced hydraulic tube had the potential to rub against a fuel line with each vibration of the engine. For the first few hours, everything would seem completely normal. The passengers would rest peacefully. The pilots would perform their routine checks without concern. Yet that small, unseen defect would soon begin to reveal itself, not through noise or vibration, but through subtle data changes on the flight deck displays. By the time those readings appeared, the aircraft would already be halfway across the Atlantic, far from land, radar, or rescue. The Airbus A330-200 was, in 2001, among the most advanced airliners in the world. Introduced in the mid-1990s, it had quickly earned a reputation for safety, fuel efficiency, and technological sophistication. Designed for long-haul routes, the twin-engine jet could carry more than 300 passengers over 7,000 miles non-stop. Air Transat's Flight 236 was operated by an A330 registered CGITS, built just 2 years before the incident. It represented the cutting edge of civil aviation technology, part of a new generation of aircraft controlled by digital computers rather than purely mechanical systems. The A330 was a fly-by-wire aircraft. Instead of physical cables linking the pilot's controls to the flight surfaces, electrical signals were transmitted through computers that constantly adjusted the plane's movements. This system allowed for smoother handling, reduced pilot workload, and multiple layers of protection to prevent the aircraft from exceeding safe limits. At the heart of its design was redundancy. Nearly every system, hydraulic, electrical, and fuel, was duplicated or triplicate. If one component failed, another would take over instantly. The aircraft's Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor, ECAM, displayed all relevant information on two bright color screens in the cockpit. Warnings, fuel data, and checklists appeared automatically, allowing the crew to diagnose problems efficiently. Powering the A330 were two Rolls-Royce Trent 772B turbofan engines, each capable of producing more than 70,000 pounds of thrust. These engines were considered extremely reliable, designed to operate for thousands of flight hours between overhauls. Their efficiency and durability made them the preferred choice for long overwater flights like Toronto to Lisbon. Before takeoff, the aircraft's fuel system was carefully programmed. Multiple tanks, including center, left wing, and right wing reservoirs, were balanced automatically to maintain stability. Fuel pumps and valves managed the flow, and the pilots could monitor every quantity on their ECAM screen. Under normal conditions, the system was so reliable that deviations of even a few hundred kilograms of fuel would trigger alerts for the crew. In the cabin, the A330 provided comfort and modern amenities rare for its time. Wide seats, quieter engines, and advanced pressurization made transatlantic travel smoother and less fatiguing. For most passengers, it was simply a large, comfortable airplane, a machine that inspired confidence through silence and size. To aviation professionals, the A330 was a triumph of automation and engineering. Its flight computers could calculate the most efficient climb, descent, and cruise settings. If one electrical generator failed, another would immediately replace it. Even in the unlikely event of total engine failure, the aircraft had emergency systems, including the ram air turbine, or RAT, capable of generating power from the slipstream to keep essential instruments alive. In short, the A330 was designed to prevent the very situation that Flight 236 would soon face. Its safety record at the time was exemplary, with millions of flight hours logged worldwide and no major accidents attributed to design flaws. For Air Transat's maintenance crews and pilots, the A330 was a trustworthy workhorse, predictable, modern, and stable. Few could imagine it suffering a catastrophic fuel problem. Yet, deep inside the right-hand engine, a small maintenance oversight had created an invisible weakness. A hydraulic tube, slightly misaligned during a previous repair, sat too close to a fuel line. As the engine vibrated through routine operations, the two components slowly began to rub together. No alarms, no smoke, no visible damage. Just the faintest abrasion, impossible to detect without removing the part entirely. That single contact point, smaller than a coin, would eventually wear through the outer casing of the fuel line. And when it did, it would set in motion a chain of events that no automation, no redundancy, and no checklist could easily stop. In command of Air Transat Flight 236 was Captain Robert Pish, a man whose flying experience spanned decades and extremes. At 48 years old, Pish was among the airline's most seasoned pilots, having accumulated more than 16,000 flight hours on a variety of aircraft, everything from small bush planes to large commercial jets. He had begun his career flying seaplanes and charter aircraft in the rugged wilderness of northern Canada, where runways were frozen lakes and navigation relied more on instinct than on instruments. Those early years had taught him how to handle unpredictable situations, a skill that would later prove vital over the Atlantic. Pish's life had not followed a simple path. In his younger years, he had faced personal and legal challenges. In the early 1980s, long before joining Air Transat, he had served 16 months of a 5-year sentence for attempting to smuggle marijuana into the United States using a small aircraft. It was a decision he would later describe as the worst mistake of his life. After serving his time, he rebuilt his career from the ground up, earning back his licenses, flying charters, and eventually re-entering the commercial aviation industry. By the time he joined Air Transat in the 1990s, he was regarded as a capable, calm, and disciplined pilot. His past was behind him, and his record within the airline was spotless. Sitting beside him on Flight 236 was First Officer Dirk de Jager, a 28-year-old pilot from Quebec. Though younger, de Jager was far from inexperienced. He had logged 5,000 flight hours, including about 400 on the Airbus A330. Known among colleagues for his professionalism and technical precision, he had joined Air Transat only a year earlier but had already impressed supervisors with his focus and composure. In the cockpit, the two men formed a balanced team. Pish brought decades of flying experience and instinct, the steady hand of a pilot who had faced emergencies before. De Jager represented the next generation of aviators, methodical, highly trained, and fluent in the complex systems of modern jets. Before departure, their pre-flight routine was smooth and uneventful. Both pilots reviewed the flight plan, weather forecasts, and fuel calculations together. The weather across the Atlantic looked ideal. Clear skies, light tailwinds, no significant turbulence. It was, by all accounts, a typical night flight. As captain, Pish was responsible for the overall conduct of the flight. De Jager handled most of the communications and navigation tasks, a standard division of duties on long-haul operations. The two men shared a quiet confidence in their aircraft and in each other. Colleagues who later reviewed the cockpit voice recordings described their tone during the early hours of the flight as calm and routine. They discussed minor route adjustments, joked lightly, and monitored the systems without concern. Every check matched the flight plan perfectly. Their professionalism would become a key factor in the hours ahead. When faced with confusing warnings and conflicting data, both pilots would fall back on their training, methodical, checklist-driven, and rational. Yet, as investigators would later determine, this same discipline also had an unintended side effect. It made them more vulnerable to a psychological trap known as confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret new information in a way that supports an existing belief. At this stage, however, there was no reason to question anything. The A330 was stable at cruise altitude, both engines running flawlessly, and fuel consumption matching expectations. The first half of the flight passed without incident. For the passengers, the night was calm. The cabin crew checked on sleeping families, refilled drinks for a few still awake, and dimmed the cabin lights to help everyone rest before morning arrival in Lisbon. In the cockpit, Pish and de Jager continued monitoring instruments and position reports as they crossed into oceanic airspace, where radar coverage ends and communication is handled by high-frequency radio. The Atlantic stretched endlessly below, black, featureless, and silent. By the time the aircraft reached the halfway point of its journey, the two pilots had no reason to expect anything unusual. Their checklists were complete, their fuel readings normal, and their systems green across the board. What neither man could know was that, deep inside the right-hand engine, that misaligned hydraulic tube had already worn through a fuel line. At first, the leak was microscopic, droplets vanishing into the hot airflow, undetectable by any gauge. But with each passing minute, the opening widened. Soon, it would begin to affect the aircraft's delicate fuel balance, the first quiet sign that something was wrong. At 9 p.m. local time, Air Transat Flight 236 began its takeoff roll-down runway 24 at Toronto Pearson International Airport. The twin Rolls-Royce Trent 772 engines roared to full power, propelling the 200-ton aircraft into the humid summer night. As the wheels lifted off the runway, the lights of the city spread beneath the fuselage like a golden web fading into blackness. Within minutes, the aircraft banked eastward, climbing smoothly toward its assigned cruising altitude. For the next several hours, everything unfolded exactly as planned. The pilots set the autopilot, adjusted climb rate, and monitored the flight path as the aircraft reached 39,000 feet over the Atlantic. The A330 stabilized into its cruise configuration, engines humming steadily at 85% thrust. Inside the cockpit, routine settled in. Captain Robert Pish reviewed the cruise checklist, reading each item aloud. Fuel checks matched the flight plan precisely. Engine temperatures, oil pressures, and electrical readings were normal. The navigation system tracked perfectly toward the first oceanic waypoint. First Officer Dirk de Jager made periodic position reports to Gander Oceanic Control, confirming their coordinates and estimated times to the next checkpoints. Over the ocean, radar coverage was absent, so these reports, transmitted via radio, were the only means of tracking aircraft positions. The night was calm. No turbulence, no lightning, no weather of concern. It was the kind of flight every crew hopes for, uneventful. In the passenger cabin, the atmosphere reflected that serenity. The cabin crew served dinner shortly after takeoff, then dimmed the lights to help passengers rest. Dozens of small reading lamps flickered here and there, and the hum of air conditioning blended with the low drone of engines. For many passengers, the trip was the beginning of long-awaited holidays. Some browsed magazines about Lisbon or Algarve resorts. Others reclined, wrapped in blankets, the quiet rhythm of the flight lulling them to sleep. Children dozed in their parents' arms. Couples leaned against each other, half awake, watching the faint glow of the cabin lights. Up front, the flight deck remained in darkness except for the glow of instruments. The two pilots alternated between short conversations and silence, occasionally glancing through the windshield at the stars. From their vantage point, the curvature of the Earth was visible, a faint blue edge separating black sky from black ocean. Every 30 minutes, de Jager performed a fuel cross-check, comparing actual fuel quantities against expected values in the flight plan. The readings were consistent. The aircraft appeared to be consuming fuel normally, about 6 tons per hour combined across both engines. As the flight progressed eastward, Toronto disappeared behind them, and the Atlantic stretched endlessly ahead. The nearest landmass was now hundreds of miles away. Beneath the aircraft, the ocean surface was invisible, hidden under layers of cloud. At around 3 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, they crossed into the middle portion of their journey, the point known among pilots as the equal time point, where turning back to Canada or continuing toward Europe would take the same amount of time. Beyond this invisible line, Lisbon was now closer than Toronto. Captain Pish noted the milestone with quiet acknowledgement. He and de Jager performed another systems check. Everything remained normal. The autopilot held altitude precisely. The airspeed indicators were stable. Cabin pressurization and temperature were nominal. As a precaution, the captain asked for a review of the weather at their destination and possible diversion fields. De Jager pulled up the latest dispatch reports. Conditions at Lisbon were clear, with light winds. Their designated alternate lodges field, a Portuguese military airbase in the Azores Islands, also reported calm skies. Satisfied, both pilots relaxed slightly. Long-haul flights over the Atlantic often involved extended periods of monitoring with little action required. They discussed routine topics, from fuel efficiency to recent route updates. By 4:30 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, most passengers were asleep. The cabin lights glowed faintly blue, and the aisles were quiet. The crew checked the galley, secured loose items, and settled in for their mid-flight duties. Everything pointed to a smooth arrival in Portugal in just over 2 hours. But somewhere deep within engine number 2, the small misaligned hydraulic tube that maintenance workers had installed days earlier continued to rub gently against the neighboring fuel line. Each vibration, imperceptible to anyone on board, shaved away another microscopic layer of metal. At first, the effect was negligible. But as the metal thinned, pressure inside the fuel pipe began to force tiny droplets through the growing gap. These droplets vaporized instantly in the hot airflow streaming through the engine nacelle, leaving no visible trace. The fuel leak had begun. It was small, almost immeasurable at first, but continuous. Over the next hour, the loss would accelerate. The A330's computer systems would begin detecting inconsistencies between the left and right wing tanks. To the pilots, these discrepancies would appear puzzling but not alarming, at least not yet. For now, the flight continued as normal. The engines purred quietly. The passengers slept. The Atlantic remained silent beneath them. Inside the cockpit, the green glow of the displays suggested that everything was exactly as it should be. But beneath that illusion of perfection, a chain of events was already unfolding. One that would soon push both men to the edge of their training and force them to fight for the survival of everyone on board. Shortly after 5 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, while Air Transat Flight 236 was cruising smoothly over the central Atlantic, the first sign of trouble appeared. It came quietly, just a single unexpected line of data on the ECAM display, the heart of the Airbus A330's monitoring system. A message blinked on the screen. English 2 oil press high/oil temp low/oil quantity low. The combination was strange. High oil pressure, low oil quantity, and low temperature rarely occurred together. In most cases, oil temperature gradually rose over long flights, not dropped. Captain Robert Pish and First Officer Dirk de Jager exchanged glances. Neither had seen this exact trio of indications before. They consulted the flight crew operating manual, FCOM, flipping through pages for any procedure that matched the abnormal readings. None did. The ECAM did not list the issue as an emergency, just an advisory, meaning it required monitoring rather than immediate action. The engine itself sounded normal, vibration levels were steady, and there were no visual signs of malfunction. De Jager made a log entry and contacted Air Transat Maintenance Control in Mirabel, Quebec, via radio. He calmly described the situation. Engine number 2, right-hand side, showing contradictory oil data. The maintenance engineer on duty acknowledged and promised to review the problem before advising further. For the next few minutes, the pilots watched the readings closely. The oil pressure remained slightly above normal. Temperature stayed low. But the engine continued running smoothly, with no fluctuations in thrust. In most cases, these kinds of readings pointed to a faulty sensor or electrical connection, not a real engine issue. The A330's complex network of sensors sometimes produced spurious warnings, a known phenomenon across many airlines. Believing it to be a minor data glitch, the crew decided to continue monitoring rather than taking drastic action. In the cabin, passengers remained unaware of anything unusual. The night was still calm, and the aircraft pressed steadily eastward. Unbeknownst to anyone on board, however, the oil readings were not false. They were the first indirect sign of a deeper problem. Inside engine number 2, the misaligned hydraulic line had already worn through the outer casing of a fuel pipe, causing a pressurized fuel leak. As fuel sprayed inside the engine nacelle, it vaporized in the hot air, creating localized cooling and pressure changes that fooled the sensors, explaining the strange oil readings. But because the leak was internal and invisible, no fluid trail appeared on the wings, and the cockpit instruments gave no direct fuel leak warning. At this stage, the rate of fuel loss was still modest, just a few hundred kilograms per hour, not enough to immediately alter total fuel calculations. Nothing yet pointed to danger. Minutes later, maintenance control radioed back. Monitor engine parameters. If the readings stay stable, continue to destination. Report if they worsen. The crew acknowledged. The readings did not worsen, they simply remained odd. For now, the issue appeared contained. The Airbus continued its crossing at 39,000 feet, engines droning evenly through the thin air. The captain noted the anomaly in the flight log and moved on to other tasks, checking waypoints, confirming position reports, reviewing arrival times. In the cabin, the gentle vibration of the engines lulled passengers into deeper sleep. No one could have guessed that one of those engines was slowly leaking away the very fuel needed to keep them airborne. As the aircraft pressed deeper into the mid-Atlantic darkness, a second, more serious warning was about to appear, one that would challenge the pilot's understanding of what was really happening. Roughly 30 minutes after the first strange engine readings, another message appeared on the ECAM display. This time it wasn't about oil. The alert read, "Fuel imbalance." First Officer Dirk de Jager brought up the fuel page on the center console. The numbers confirmed it. There was significantly more fuel in the left wing tank than in the right. Such imbalances weren't unheard of, and the Airbus was designed to handle them. The procedure was straightforward. Open the crossfeed valve to allow fuel from the left tank to flow into the right, equalizing both sides. Following standard protocol, the pilots opened the valve. The instruments responded normally. Flow indicators showed fuel transferring across the system. The imbalance appeared to begin correcting itself. But within 10 minutes, something unexpected happened. The total fuel quantity, the sum of both wing tanks and the center tank, began to drop faster than expected. At first, it was subtle, a few hundred kilograms lower than planned. Then, as the minutes passed, the discrepancy widened. De Jager double-checked the figures against the flight plan. The math didn't add up. The aircraft had burned far more fuel than projected for that stage of the flight. Pish looked up from the displays. "How much are we missing?" he asked. "Almost 2 tons, De Jager replied. That figure caught the captain's attention. 2 tons of fuel could not simply vanish. He checked the engine readings again. Thrust normal, temperature stable, fuel flow indicators consistent with cruise settings. The first officer ran the calculations again, thinking it might be a data entry error. But the numbers were correct. The aircraft was losing fuel quickly. For the first time that night, both men realized they might have a serious problem. Pish ordered a manual fuel check, comparing each tank's reading to the expected totals. The right wing tank continued to fall faster than the left. The difference between the two sides kept growing. What if it's not a transfer problem? De Jager asked quietly. Pish frowned. Could be a sensor fault. We'll confirm. The possibility of a fuel leak was briefly mentioned, but neither man believed it was likely. Fuel leaks on large airliners were rare, and the A330 had multiple layers of protection against them. Moreover, if a leak existed, it would normally leave visible traces. Vapor streaming behind the wing or drops seen by the cabin crew from the windows. To be certain, the captain contacted the senior flight attendant over the interphone. He requested that the crew inspect the right wing and engine area for any visible signs of fuel or vapor. Within minutes, the message came back. Nothing unusual. No streaks, no smell of fuel, no mist outside. Everything appeared normal. That visual confirmation seemed to rule out the leak hypothesis. If there was no visible fuel trail, and both engines continued running smoothly, the only logical conclusion was that the readings were wrong, a sensor malfunction. The captain and first officer had now seen two sets of questionable data in less than an hour. The earlier oil readings and now the fuel imbalance. In both cases, the most likely explanation was faulty sensors. To test the theory, they closed the crossfeed valve again and watched. The fuel quantities continued to fall. But still, there was no clear pattern indicating a leak. At 5:45 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the situation escalated further. The ECAM generated another advisory, Fuel QTYLOW, check fuel. At that moment, total fuel on board had dropped below 7 tons. A dangerously low figure for their position, still hundreds of miles from any diversion airport. Captain Pish realized they would not be able to reach Lisbon. He made a quick decision. They would divert to Lodge's air base in the Azores Islands, the only viable option in the middle of the Atlantic. He turned to his co-pilot. Set course for Lodge's. Notify Santa Maria Control. De Jager transmitted the diversion message and began calculating the required descent profile. Fuel continued to drop. At their current rate of consumption, they would run dry before reaching the Azores, unless the readings were false. The captain chose to believe they were. In aviation, fuel leaks that large were virtually unheard of. The loss rate suggested a catastrophic rupture, something the crew would have noticed physically. Yet the aircraft flew flawlessly. Must be a computer issue, Pish muttered. They maintained altitude and pressed on. To the passengers, nothing had changed. The cabin remained quiet. Most were still asleep. The crew continued routine service, unaware that their aircraft might be running out of fuel. In the cockpit, however, numbers continued to fall. Every few minutes, another 100 kilograms disappeared from the total. The pilots could not know that the right-hand engine number 2, was now venting thousands of liters of fuel into the slipstream. The open crossfeed valve, meant to fix the imbalance, was now feeding that leak from the left tank as well. The very action they had taken to solve the imbalance had connected both sides of the fuel system, allowing the leak to drain nearly the entire aircraft. By the time they realized how fast the fuel was disappearing, it would be too late to undo it. As the aircraft continued its lonely path across the Atlantic, the numbers on the fuel display kept dropping faster than reason could explain. At first, the pilots thought it might be a temporary sensor drift, something the A330 software would correct. But as minutes passed, the readings made less and less sense. Fuel that should have lasted another 3 hours was vanishing before their eyes. By 6 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the total fuel indicated just 7.5 tons. Well below the flight plan's expected 17 tons for that position. Captain Robert Pish leaned back in his seat, staring at the screen. That can't be right, he muttered. We would have noticed something by now. First Officer Dirk de Jager double-checked the flow rates. Both engines were consuming fuel at perfectly normal levels, roughly 2.5 tons per hour each. Nothing pointed to a leak. They considered their options. If the readings were true, the plane would run out of fuel before reaching Europe. But if they were false, if the sensors were malfunctioning, descending or shutting down systems might only make things worse. The two men decided to continue toward the Azores, their designated diversion field. They radioed Santa Maria Control, reporting a fuel discrepancy and intent to divert to Lodge's Field on Terceira Island. Air traffic control cleared the change immediately, offering headings and distance. At that moment, they were about 500 kilometers away, roughly an hour's flight time. Inside the cockpit, tension grew. The fuel gauges showed a steady decline, faster than any reasonable consumption rate. Pish asked the cabin crew to check again for external signs of fuel leakage. The lead flight attendant and two others peered through windows near the right wing. They saw nothing. No vapor trail, no fluid streaks, no shimmering mist in the lights. Their report confirmed the captain's suspicion. The instruments had to be wrong. But in truth, the situation was worse than either man realized. Deep within engine number 2, fuel was spraying into the engine compartment through a ruptured pipe. A rupture caused by a hydraulic line that had been incorrectly installed during maintenance. The pipe had gradually worn through until it broke entirely. Now, each minute, a metric ton of fuel was pouring out of the right engine and venting into the atmosphere. The crossfeed valve, opened earlier to balance the tanks, was now feeding the leak from both sides of the system. Instead of stabilizing, the imbalance had connected the entire fuel supply to the breach. The aircraft was bleeding fuel at a catastrophic rate. Inside the cockpit, however, the data seemed ambiguous. The pilots reviewed every page of the ECAM, checking for confirmation. There were no fuel leak warnings. The A330 software had not been programmed to detect abnormally fast fuel loss across tanks. Only internal imbalances or pump failures. Believing the readings to be false, the crew fell victim to what psychologists call confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret information in a way that supports an existing belief. Their mental model, formed earlier when the engine's oil readings acted strangely, was that the aircraft's sensors were misbehaving. New data, the rapid fuel loss, fit neatly into that framework. To them, the instruments were once again wrong. They reasoned that if a real leak existed, at least one system would have failed: thrust, pressure, or temperature. Yet all parameters remained normal. "Everything's working fine," de Jager noted. Pish nodded. "Then the problem is the display, not the tanks." Meanwhile, fuel continued to stream unseen into the slipstream. At 6:15 a.m., Air Transat's maintenance center in Mirabel, Quebec, received another radio call from the crew. They reported unusual fuel readings and requested guidance. On the ground, engineers reviewed the telemetry and reached a similar conclusion. The figures were inconsistent, but not alarming enough to declare an emergency. They instructed the crew to monitor the situation and proceed to Lodges as planned. For several minutes, the flight continued quietly. But inside the fuel system, levels were dropping at an accelerating rate. The left and right wing tanks were now nearly empty. The Airbus A330 systems, though redundant, could not account for what was happening. Each algorithm assumed at least one engine was consuming fuel normally. None were designed for the possibility of both being starved by a leak. At 6:30 a.m., another ECAM alert sounded. "Fuel quantity low, land ASAP." This was no longer advisory. It was a warning. By now, total fuel on board was down to 4.8 tons. Barely an hour's worth of endurance. At cruise power, that meant the aircraft could not reach land. Even descending would not buy much time. Still, the crew struggled to believe that a real leak existed. "Fuel leaks this big don't just happen," Pish said quietly. "We'd see something." The data didn't fit their understanding of how failures occur. The A330 was too new, too advanced, too carefully engineered. They were now trapped between two competing realities. The instruments insisted they were almost out of fuel, while every other system said the aircraft was healthy. The captain made a choice to trust the latter. He reduced thrust slightly to conserve fuel, then continued toward Lodges, still 200 nautical miles away. Unbeknownst to him, the engines were consuming the last of what little fuel remained in the left wing tank. Within minutes, the numbers would drop to zero. Inside the cabin, Passengers began to stir as the first light of dawn touched the horizon. The aircraft descended slightly, banking left toward its diversion course. Nothing seemed unusual. But beneath the calm, the A330's situation had become critical. The instruments were not lying. The fuel was almost gone. And soon, the right-hand engine, the source of the leak, would take its last breath. At 6:45 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the tension inside the cockpit of Air Transat Flight 236 reached its breaking point. The fuel quantity display continued to plummet, even though the engines showed stable thrust and performance. Every few minutes, the total figure dropped by another few hundred kilograms. Captain Robert Pish and First Officer Dirk de Jager cross-checked the readings once more. The math didn't lie. If these numbers were accurate, the aircraft had barely enough fuel to remain airborne for another 30 minutes. Yet both engines continued running smoothly. To the crew, that contradiction didn't make sense. How can we be burning that much fuel and still have normal flow? Pish asked aloud. De Jager shook his head. There's no way. These must be false indications. They had already decided to divert toward Lodge's field in the Azores Islands, but as they checked their navigation screen, they realized the gravity of the situation. They were about 240 kilometers away, too far for the remaining fuel, assuming the gauges were right. The cockpit was now filled with quiet urgency. They discussed the possibility of performing the fuel leak checklist but quickly ran into a dilemma. The checklist procedure required descending to 20,000 feet to verify and isolate the leak. Captain Pish hesitated. Descending meant losing precious altitude, their most valuable resource if the engines failed. If this is a false reading, he reasoned, dropping altitude will only put us closer to the water for no reason. He made the call to stay at 39,000 feet and continue toward the Azores. In that moment, he was unknowingly making a decision that human factors experts would later call a textbook case of framing bias, a cognitive bias in which people choose between options based on how those options are presented. The fuel leak checklist demanded an immediate guaranteed loss, descending and losing range. Ignoring it offered a chance, however slim, of avoiding the problem entirely. Faced with a certain loss versus a potential one, most humans, even trained pilots, instinctively choose to gamble on hope. As the aircraft pressed onward, the ECAM generated another warning. Fuel quantity low, land ASAP. Pish ordered de Jager to declare an emergency. The first officer radioed Santa Maria Control. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Air Transat 236 declaring fuel emergency. Dual fuel problem. Request immediate vectors to Lodges. The controller cleared the skies ahead, granting priority and giving headings. The voice on the radio was calm, but the tone carried weight. Everyone understood what this meant. Down in the cabin, the flight attendants noticed the subtle pitch change as the aircraft began descending. The captain informed them over the interphone that they were diverting due to a fuel issue. He instructed them to prepare for a possible emergency landing. None of the passengers yet knew how serious the situation had become. By 6:13 a.m., the right-hand engine, number 2, flamed out. In an instant, the thrust reading dropped to 0. Warning chimes echoed through the cockpit. English to fail. The aircraft shuddered slightly as asymmetric thrust pulled it to one side. De Jager immediately took control while Pish adjusted power on the remaining engine. They were now flying on a single engine, but the A330 could still remain airborne, though it could no longer maintain 39,000 feet. Pish began a controlled descent to 33,000 feet, trimming the aircraft to keep the glide steady. "Let's keep her going as far as we can," he said quietly. The ECAM continued to flash warnings, electrical, hydraulic, and fuel-related, cascading faster than the crew could acknowledge them. With one engine running, the aircraft's range had narrowed further. Lodges was still more than 100 kilometers away. The two men focused entirely on one task: stay airborne. The captain set the aircraft into its best long-range glide configuration, balancing speed and altitude. Minutes later, at 6:26 a.m., the left engine, number 1, began to surge. Its fuel flow indicator flickered, and then silence. Both engines had failed. The cockpit went dark except for the glow of standby instruments powered by the ram air turbine, RAT, which had automatically deployed from the aircraft's belly. The faint hum of its small propeller was the only sound. At that altitude, the A330 had become the world's largest glider, more than 200 tons of metal, gliding silently through the morning sky. The captain immediately took manual control. Without engines, the hydraulic systems lost pressure, making the controls heavy and sluggish. The yaw dampers and auto-thrust were gone. The aircraft's handling now depended entirely on manual adjustments. Pish's years of experience in smaller planes came back instinctively. He knew how to glide an aircraft, but never one of this size. De Jager monitored the few remaining instruments: airspeed, altitude, and heading. "We're descending at 2,000 feet per minute," he reported. "At this rate, we've got 15 minutes, Pish replied. In the cabin, the lights flickered out. The sudden silence startled passengers awake. The hum of the engines, ever present on every flight, was gone. The aircraft felt weightless, eerily smooth. Oxygen masks dropped. Flight attendants rushed through the aisles, calming passengers and instructing them to secure their belts. Some began to cry. Others prayed silently. For the crew, the mission was simple but nearly impossible. Glide to land before hitting the ocean. Below them lay the dark expanse of the Atlantic, empty, cold, and unforgiving. Pish adjusted the pitch to maintain the optimal glide speed, 210 knots. At this configuration, the A330 could glide approximately 15 nautical miles for every 4,000 feet of altitude, barely enough to reach lodges if conditions held. He turned slightly toward the island, now visible as a faint glow on the horizon. Both men knew that if their calculations were off by even a few miles, the aircraft would fall short and ditch into the sea. But there was no time left for debate. Every second, the altimeter wound lower. Pish steadied the controls, eyes fixed on the faint shape of land ahead. "We're going to make it," he said, more as focus than reassurance. Behind him, 306 souls sat in silence, unaware that their fate now depended on a powerless glide. A descent through the thin air of dawn, where every meter counted. The moment both engines failed, the Airbus A330 became the largest glider in history. All thrust was gone, all power lost. Yet the aircraft still sliced through the air with silent determination, descending at a steady 2,000 feet per minute. Inside the cockpit, the ram air turbine, RAT, spun furiously beneath the fuselage, generating a fraction of the power normally provided by the engines. That small spinning fan was now keeping the flight controls, attitude indicators, and primary radios alive. Everything else, cabin lights, autopilot, galley systems, and most instrumentation, had gone dark. Captain Robert Pish gripped the side stick, flying entirely by feel. The controls were heavy, unassisted by hydraulics, and the aircraft responded sluggishly. Beside him, First Officer Dirk de Jager read out their key data: altitude, airspeed, distance to land. Altitude 33,000, de Jager said. Speed 210 knots. Pish nodded. Hold that speed. It's our best glide. They had roughly 15 minutes of flight time before reaching sea level. Ahead, their only hope, the island of Terceira, home to Lodge's air base, lay just over 100 kilometers away. In the cabin, the sudden silence felt surreal. The familiar engine hum that had filled the air for hours was gone, replaced by a faint rush of wind. Oxygen masks hung from the ceiling, swinging gently as passengers breathed through them. The flight attendants moved quickly, checking rows and instructing everyone to brace for a possible ditching. The pilots, meanwhile, faced a delicate balance. Too slow, and the aircraft would stall, losing lift and dropping uncontrollably. Too fast, and they would lose altitude too quickly to reach the island. Their instruments, now powered only by the RAT, showed minimal data. Fuel indicators read 0. Hydraulic pressure was marginal. Electrical systems were flickering under the strain. Pish and de Jager exchanged few words. Both men were focused entirely on their tasks, one flying, the other calculating. They estimated that if they could maintain a glide ratio of roughly 15-1, they might just reach land. It would be a razor-thin margin. At 25,000 feet, The captain called the cabin crew over the interphone. His message was brief. Prepare for emergency landing. We are gliding to lodges. The chief flight attendant acknowledged, her voice steady despite the fear she must have felt. She turned to her team and began instructing passengers on how to brace, how to secure infants, and how to tighten seatbelts. Outside, dawn had begun to break. A faint orange glow touched the horizon ahead, the first light of morning revealing the endless ocean below. At 20,000 feet, the island appeared. A dark outline surrounded by white surf, still distant but visible through thin clouds. Relief flickered in the cockpit, tempered by the realization that they were still too far out. De Jager recalculated. Distance 65 miles. Altitude 20,000. Glide ratio is holding, we might make it. But as they drew closer, the wind began to shift. A light headwind, only a few knots, reduced their effective range. It was enough to raise doubts again. In aviation, even a single knot of headwind could alter the math. Pish kept the aircraft steady, flying manually with delicate inputs. Without autopilot, his hands and feet had to coordinate every movement. Every small correction cost energy, every twitch of the control surfaces sapped glide efficiency. He knew from experience that altitude was life. So he chose to keep the aircraft as high as possible, conserving vertical distance until absolutely necessary. At 15,000 feet, the pressure in the cabin began to drop. Without engines, there was no longer air compression feeding the pressurization system. The oxygen masks deployed automatically. Passengers gasped as thin air filled their lungs. De Jager donned his own mask and continued monitoring. Cabin depressurization confirmed. Masks deployed, he said between breaths. Copy, Pish replied, eyes fixed ahead. The cockpit fell silent again except for the wind rushing past the fuselage. Each minute brought new challenges. Electrical power fluctuated, briefly dimming the instruments. The RAT whined loudly outside, spinning faster with every descent. The hydraulic systems, deprived of full pressure, made the controls sluggish. Turning or adjusting pitch required muscle. Pish flew with both hands on the side stick, sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool cabin air. At 12,000 feet, they could see the island clearly now, rugged cliffs and a strip of flat land where the airbase runway stretched toward the sea. They had range, but perhaps too much altitude. We're high, De Jager noted. I'll handle it, Pish said. Being too high was a problem, but a manageable one. Being too low would have been fatal. He adjusted the descent slightly, trading some speed for altitude control. The A330 continued gliding gracefully, like a silent phantom against the dawn sky. In the cabin, the flight attendants moved through the aisles one last time, checking seatbelts and brace positions. The captain's voice came through the intercom. Calm, measured. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are diverting to the island of Terceira for an emergency landing. Please remain seated and follow the crew's instructions. There was no panic, just a heavy, tense quiet. At 10,000 feet, the tower at Lodges Field made visual contact. The radar confirmed their position and altitude. The air traffic controller began clearing the runway and mobilizing emergency services. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue crews lined the tarmac, waiting for what could be a catastrophic landing. For the pilots, there was no going around, no second attempt. Once they descended toward the runway, it would be a single, irreversible glide. The captain called for the landing checklist, abbreviated now since most systems were unpowered. De Jager lowered the landing gear using the emergency manual crank. The doors opened slowly, and the gear locked into place with a heavy thud. Next, they extended the slats and partial flaps, devices that would allow the aircraft to fly slower without stalling. The extra lift came at a cost, increased drag, which shortened their remaining glide distance. It was a delicate balance. Too much drag, and they would fall short. Too little, and they would arrive too fast. At 8,000 feet, the island filled the windshield. The runway lights at Lodges blinked faintly in the distance. Field in sight, De Jager said. Copy. We're going for it, Pish replied. The approach was anything but standard. The aircraft was descending too steeply and too fast. To bleed off altitude, Pish initiated a wide 360-degree turn over the ocean, keeping visual contact with the runway. As the A330 circled, he managed to lose several thousand feet while maintaining control. When the turn ended, they were still high but now lined up with the runway. De Jager quickly extended more flaps to increase drag. The nose dipped slightly as the massive airliner lined up for its final approach. The airspeed indicator showed 200 knots, far above a normal landing speed. The aircraft was heavy, unpowered, and unbalanced. "Too fast," De Jager warned. "We'll take what we've got," Pish said. "This is all or nothing." At 5,000 feet, they crossed the island's coastline. The runway stretched straight ahead, narrow, bright, and unforgiving. Every second now mattered. The crew's eyes moved between the horizon and the altimeter, counting down the altitude in hundreds of feet. 2,000 feet. Speed 195. Keep it steady. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to a single glowing strip of concrete on an island in the Atlantic. Behind them, the passengers braced. Flight attendants crouched in the aisles, heads down, arms locked. In front of them, the runway lights grew larger. The captain lowered the nose slightly, guiding the aircraft toward its one and only chance at survival. The Airbus A330 descended through 1,000 feet, still gliding, still silent, as dawn broke fully over the island. At 6:50 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the Airbus A330, now gliding silently, crossed the northern edge of Terceira Island. The crew could finally see Lodge's air base clearly, a long, light gray runway stretching between green hills and the blue expanse of the Atlantic. But one problem was immediately obvious. They were too high. From 8 miles out, the altimeter read 13,000 feet, far above the standard glide path for landing. Normally, an aircraft should be around 3,000 feet at that distance. In a powered airplane, excess altitude could be bled off by reducing thrust or performing a go-around. But with no engines, neither option existed. Captain Robert Pish and First Officer Dirk de Jager needed to lose altitude quickly, without overshooting the island or losing their only shot at the runway. "Too high," de Jager said. "I see it," replied Pish, eyes locked on the runway lights far ahead. They had one tool left: the turn. At 11,000 feet, Pish rolled the A330 sharply into a 360-degree descending turn over the ocean, keeping the airfield in sight at all times. The aircraft tilted gently at 25 degrees of bank, trading altitude for distance while maintaining glide speed. Inside the cabin, passengers felt the shift. The horizon tilted, and faint centrifugal force pressed them sideways in their seats. Few knew this maneuver was deliberate, an improvised way to lose several thousand feet while staying aligned with the runway. Halfway through the turn, de Jager manually extended the landing gear. The standard hydraulic pumps were dead, so he cranked the emergency release lever. The gear doors opened slowly under gravity, locking into place with a heavy thud. The extra drag helped slow the aircraft further, but at the cost of glide range. When the circle was complete, the A330 was now facing the runway again, but still slightly high. Pish performed a second adjustment, a series of S-turns, banking left, then right, to bleed off the final excess altitude. "Altitude 5,000, de Jager called out. "Speed 190, Pish replied. "Keep it steady." The A330 was now lined up perfectly with runway 33 at Lodge's. Emergency vehicles waited along its full length, fire engines, ambulances, and rescue crews standing ready. The approach, however, was far from standard. Without engines, there was no thrust reverse, no go-around, and no margin for error. Every movement now depended entirely on gravity and precision. "Flaps?" Pish asked. De Jager extended the slats and partial flaps, just enough to add lift but not so much as to stall the aircraft. The hydraulic pressure from the rat provided barely enough force to move them. The airspeed remained high, roughly 200 knots, about 50 faster than a typical landing speed. But any slower and they risked losing control. At 3,000 feet, the island filled the windshield. Houses, fields, and roads flashed beneath them. The approach path carried them directly over the coastal town of Praia de Vitória, where residents looked up to see a massive airliner descending silently overhead. In the tower, the controller watched anxiously. He could see the aircraft's landing lights flickering against the morning sky. Air Transat 236, runway clear, wind calm. You are cleared to land, he transmitted. Pish's response was short. Roger, cleared to land. At 1,000 feet, the crew focused on keeping the wings level. With minimal hydraulics, even small corrections were slow to respond. De Jager read out the data rhythmically. Airspeed 185. Altitude 800. Sync rate 1800. The aircraft crossed the final approach lights. The runway stretched before them, narrow, straight, and rising slightly uphill. 500, De Jager called. Landing, Pish confirmed. The captain pulled back gently on the side stick, holding the descent rate steady. 300, 200. There was no sound except the wind. The A330 swept over the threshold, just meters above the tarmac. At 150 feet, Pish flared the nose slightly. The massive aircraft touched down hard on the main gear. The impact jolted the cabin. The tires screeched as 8 of 12 burst instantly, rubber shredding against the concrete. The plane bounced once, then slammed back down. Sparks shot from the landing gear struts. The aircraft skidded, heavy and unbalanced, as Pish pushed the brake pedals to their limits. Without engines, there were no thrust reversers to slow them. The anti-skid system, deprived of full power, failed almost immediately. The wheels locked and began to grind away. Brakes only, Pish called. Hold her straight. De Jager fought the rudder pedals, using what little hydraulic control remained to keep the plane centered. The A330 roared down the runway, a plume of smoke and sparks trailing behind. Metal scraped. The smell of burnt rubber filled the air. After nearly 2 kilometers of skidding, the speed dropped 120 knots, then 80, then 40. The heavy jet finally came to a grinding halt just short of the runway's end. For a second, there was complete silence. Then Pish looked at his first officer. Everyone alive? De Jager nodded. Yes, Captain. We made it. The captain's next order was immediate. Evacuate. He pulled the handle to arm the slides. Cabin crew opened the doors, and bright sunlight flooded the interior. Passengers rushed to the exits, sliding down onto the runway as emergency vehicles approached. Firefighters doused the left landing gear, where small fires had started from the friction. Within seconds, the flames were out. All 306 people on board survived. The glide was over. The impossible had been done. The Airbus A330 had come to rest at the far end of runway 33 at Lodge's Air Base. Engine silent, tires shredded, and fuselage steaming from the heat of friction. For a few seconds after it stopped, there was only stunned quiet. Inside the cabin, no one moved. Then the smell of burned rubber and faint smoke reached the aisles, and instinct took over. Captain Robert Pish wasted no time. Evacuate, he ordered. First Officer Dirk de Jager echoed the command over the public address system, his voice calm but urgent. Evacuate, evacuate. The flight attendants sprang into action. Years of training took over as they released the door locks and deployed the emergency slides. Sunlight burst into the dim cabin, and fresh air rushed in. The first slides inflated instantly, bright orange against the concrete. Passengers began exiting in an orderly but hurried flow. Some cried, others simply stared ahead in shock. Within seconds, the first people hit the runway and ran clear of the aircraft. Despite the chaos, the cabin crew maintained control, shouting instructions, keeping people moving, and preventing anyone from grabbing luggage. Within 90 seconds, every passenger and crew member was off the plane. All 306 people who had boarded in Toronto were now standing safely on the runway. Behind them, the aircraft sat silent and motionless. Its landing gear collapsed slightly, the fuselage tilted, smoke curling from beneath the wings. The right engine, source of the massive fuel leak, was scorched around the nacelle. Firefighters, already positioned beside the runway, sprayed foam over the undercarriage to cool the overheated brakes and extinguish the small fires still burning in the wheel wells. Incredibly, there were no fatalities. Several passengers suffered minor injuries, sprains, bruises, and slight burns, but all had survived what should have been an unsurvivable event: a dual-engine failure at cruise altitude over the open ocean. Rescue teams quickly led the survivors away from the aircraft. Many turned back to look at the jet, now resting in the soft morning light, surrounded by foam and fire trucks. Some wept quietly. Others stood in silence, realizing only then how close they had come to disaster. In the control tower, the lodge's air traffic controllers watched in disbelief. The airplane they had tracked on radar, first at 39,000 feet, then as a powerless glider descending steadily across the ocean, now sat safely at the end of their runway. It was a feat no one expected to witness. On the ground, the base commander approached the captain. Pish, still in his seat, was checking the overhead panel one last time before leaving the cockpit. "Captain, are you all right?" the commander asked. Pish nodded, exhaling slowly. "We're all fine," he replied. "Everyone made it." For the next few hours, the airfield was filled with emergency crews, investigators, and medical staff. Passengers were escorted to the terminal, where they were given blankets, water, and phones to contact their families. Many broke down in tears as they spoke to loved ones, their voices trembling with relief. Meanwhile, the cockpit voice and flight data recorders were removed for analysis. Investigators from Transport Canada, the Portuguese Air Force, and the Bureau d'Enquêtes et d'Analyses, BEA, in France began examining the aircraft to determine how such a modern airliner had lost all power mid-flight. From the outside, the plane looked mostly intact, no broken wings, no fire damage to the fuselage. But a closer inspection of engine number 2 revealed the answer. Inside the engine nacelle, a hydraulic tube had been installed incorrectly during a recent maintenance procedure. Over time, it had rubbed against a fuel line, wearing it thin until it ruptured. Once that happened, fuel began leaking into the engine bay and venting overboard. It was an extraordinary mechanical failure, one that combined with human factors to nearly cause catastrophe. When the initial investigation findings reached the crew, both Pish and de Jager were stunned. They had done everything by the book, yet the book itself had failed them. The A330 systems had offered no warning for abnormally rapid fuel loss. The crossfeed valve, which they opened to balance the tanks, had unknowingly linked both wings, allowing the leak to drain the entire aircraft. Despite the chain of errors and oversights, what mattered most that morning was clear. Through judgment, discipline, and composure, the crew had turned a potential mass fatality into a story of survival. As dawn spread across the island, the passengers of Flight 236 gathered together in the small terminal. Some were barefoot, others wrapped in airline blankets. Many hugged the crew members who had guided them through the ordeal. For the first time since the silence began over the Atlantic, laughter and tears mixed freely. Outside, emergency crews continued cooling the aircraft's brakes. The jet, still glistening with foam and dew, stood as a silent monument to what had just happened, the longest successful glide ever achieved by a commercial airliner. In the hours following the landing at Lodge's airbase, the scale of what had just occurred began to sink in. A twin-engine, long-haul airliner had crossed hundreds of kilometers of open ocean with both engines dead, and landed without a single fatality. The aviation world had never seen anything like it. By the next day, investigators from Transport Canada, the Portuguese Air Force, and Airbus arrived on Terceira Island. The focus of their inquiry was twofold: what had caused the fuel loss, and why the crew had not recognized it in time. The answers began to emerge quickly. The maintenance error. Examining engine number 2, investigators discovered the source of the leak: a hydraulic line in the engine's pylon that had been replaced during maintenance 2 weeks earlier. The replacement part, a small metal tube about the width of a finger, came from a slightly different engine model. Its alignment was off by only a few millimeters. That tiny difference was enough to make the hydraulic line press against an adjacent fuel pipe. Over successive flights, the vibration of the engine caused the metal surfaces to rub together. On Flight 236, the fuel line finally ruptured. Fuel under high pressure spewed into the engine bay, venting through drains and overboard. The leak was catastrophic, roughly 1 ton of fuel every 5 minutes, but completely invisible from the cockpit or passenger windows. The chain of human factors. While the mechanical cause was now clear, investigators also examined why the pilots had misdiagnosed the problem. The data recorders showed that from the moment the leak began, both men acted calmly and methodically, consulting checklists, contacting maintenance, and managing the aircraft according to procedure. Yet they never carried out the fuel leak checklist, the only procedure that could have saved enough fuel to reach land with engines running. Experts later determined that 2 well-documented psychological effects had influenced their judgment: confirmation bias and framing bias. Confirmation bias made the pilots interpret every new symptom as support for their initial belief that the sensors were faulty. Framing bias influenced how they viewed their options. The required checklist called for descending to 20,000 feet to verify a leak, which seemed like a guaranteed loss of altitude and range. By contrast, maintaining cruise altitude offered at least the possibility that the readings were wrong. Faced with uncertainty, they chose the path that seemed to preserve hope. Compounding these factors was a design limitation in the aircraft itself. The Airbus A330's computer logic did not generate a specific fuel leak warning. It could detect imbalances between tanks, but not rapid total fuel loss. The ECAM displayed only generic advisories such as fuel imbalance or fuel quantity low, leaving the crew to interpret what was happening. What could have been? Analysts later simulated the flight under alternative scenarios. Had the pilots executed any of the fuel leak procedures when they first noticed the imbalance, the engine leak, wing leak, or unspecified leak checklist, they would have reached lodges with 3.8 metric tons of fuel remaining. But under the actual conditions, by the time both engines flamed out, the aircraft carried less than 300 kilograms. Barely enough to keep the turbines turning for another minute. The record glide. Despite the earlier misjudgment, investigators emphasized the crew's performance after the flameouts. Captain Pish's manual control of the powerless aircraft was described as exceptional. He maintained precise glide speed, executed a complex 360-degree turn, and performed a landing at high speed with limited hydraulics, all without prior simulator training for such a scenario. The final report, released in 2002, stated, "The captain's handling of the aircraft during the engine-out descent and landing was remarkable, given the stressful conditions, night operations, limited instruments, and absence of thrust control." The report also commended First Officer de Jaeger for maintaining composure, managing communications, and providing accurate callouts throughout the descent. Their teamwork had transformed a potential tragedy into one of aviation's most extraordinary survivals. Immediate reforms. In response to the incident, Airbus issued a major software update to its A330 and A340 fleets, adding a new ECAM function, fuel leak detected, high fuel loss rate. This warning would trigger automatically if the system noticed unusually rapid fuel depletion not explained by engine flow rates. Air Transat, for its part, revised its training syllabus to include dedicated fuel leak recognition procedures and expanded instruction on human factors awareness, emphasizing how cognitive bias can distort judgment under pressure. Maintenance protocols were also tightened. Technicians were required to double verify component compatibility by part number, not just physical fit, before installation. Public reaction. When news of the event reached the media, headlines around the world called it the miracle glide. Many portrayed Captain Pish as a hero. In interviews, he rejected the label, insisting the outcome had been the result of training, teamwork, and luck. Both pilots received the Superior Airmanship Award from the Airline Pilots Association the following year, one of the highest honors in professional aviation. Still, for investigators, the event remained a sobering reminder. The same professionalism that saved the flight had also contributed to the initial misunderstanding. In aviation, even experienced crews are vulnerable to the limits of human perception and the complexity of modern systems. By the time the inquiry closed, the story of Air Transat Flight 236 had become required study material in flight safety courses around the world. It was more than a mechanical failure or a near disaster. It was a case study in how humans and machines interact when both are pushed beyond the boundaries of expectation. The story of Air Transat Flight 236 became more than just an aviation incident. It became a cornerstone case study in how human judgment, technology, and error intersect in moments of crisis. When the official reports were published, the global aviation community took notice. The event highlighted not only the extraordinary skill of the crew but also the vulnerabilities built into even the most sophisticated aircraft systems, redefining modern airmanship. For pilots worldwide, the glide of Flight 236 reshaped what airmanship meant. It wasn't just about technical proficiency or checklists, it was about understanding human psychology in high-stress decision-making. Flight academies began incorporating the case into training modules under Crew Resource Management, CRM, focusing on how confirmation bias and framing bias can unconsciously shape judgment. In simulators, instructors recreated similar ambiguous situations where instruments contradicted intuition, forcing pilots to make decisions based on incomplete data. One key lesson was this: even the most advanced cockpit technology cannot replace situational skepticism. Modern pilots were reminded that while automation assists, it can also mislead if its data is misinterpreted. Airbus system reforms. For Airbus, the incident prompted a major review of its cockpit logic systems. The company introduced a new algorithm to detect abnormal fuel loss rates, a feature now standard on all A330 and A340 aircraft. This new alert allowed pilots to see, in real time, whether fuel was being consumed faster than both engines could account for. It turned what was once an ambiguous warning into a clear diagnosis. The manufacturer also issued updated training bulletins to all A330 operators, emphasizing that unusual fuel imbalances should always trigger suspicion of a leak, regardless of visual confirmation or system silence. In later interviews, Airbus engineers admitted that the Flight 236 event rewrote part of the logic tree behind ECAM warnings. The software update effectively closed the gap that had left Pish and de Jager uncertain about what they were seeing. Air Transat's transformation. For Air Transat, the event was both a wake-up call and a redemption story. The airline quickly implemented comprehensive maintenance oversight reforms. Every engine repair, replacement, or component modification now required dual sign-off by 2 certified technicians, eliminating the kind of cross-model part substitution that caused the failure. Pilot training was also updated. Crews were re-educated on recognizing indirect signs of a fuel leak, including unexpected imbalances, unusual flow rates, or faster-than-normal consumption, even in the absence of visible evidence. The company's internal culture shifted from procedural compliance to diagnostic thinking, encouraging crews to question systems instead of trusting them blindly. The human element. For Captain Robert Pish, the experience left a lasting impact. When interviewed years later, he reflected on the flight with humility. "We didn't save the airplane because of luck alone. We saved it because training worked, but also because we never gave up." He returned to flying for Air Transat after the investigation concluded, often piloting the same route between Toronto and Lisbon, a quiet, full-circle return to the skies. His first officer, Dirk de Jager, continued his aviation career as well. Both men remained respected within the industry, often invited to speak about decision-making under pressure. Their story became a required topic in flight safety courses, not just as an example of survival, but as a living reminder that human beings, even trained experts, are part of the safety chain, not outside it. A legacy in numbers. To this day, Flight 236 holds the record for the longest glide ever completed by a commercial airliner, approximately 75 nautical miles, 140 kilometers, with no engine power. The glide duration, nearly 19 minutes, remains a benchmark achievement in aviation history. More importantly, it stands as a rare example of complete crew and passenger survival in a total dual-engine failure over open water. Cautionary tale. Beyond the statistics, Flight 236 serves as a quiet warning. It demonstrates how modern aviation, while extraordinarily safe, still depends on an intricate balance of human and machine trust. The event revealed that even small errors, a misplaced hydraulic tube, a delayed checklist, or an assumption about sensor accuracy, can cascade into a life-threatening situation. But it also proved that calm professionalism and adaptability can still triumph over chaos. The aircraft itself, repaired and restored, was eventually returned to service under a new registration. It continued flying for years after the incident, a tangible reminder that even machines which once failed can return to the sky. Cultural impact. In documentaries and aviation studies, Flight 236 is often mentioned alongside other defining survival stories, such as the Miracle on the Hudson and United 232 in Sioux City. But what makes the Air Transat story distinct is its isolation. When the A330 lost both engines, there was no land in sight, no nearby rescue, and no second chance. Only skill, teamwork, and altitude stood between life and death. The story inspired films, safety programs, and academic research papers on cockpit decision-making. For many viewers, it served as a powerful reminder of both the fragility and resilience of flight. Closing perspective. In the years since the event, Flight 236 has come to symbolize a paradox, a failure that strengthened aviation. A cascade of small mistakes led to the crisis, but the response demonstrated the industry's greatest strength: its capacity to learn, adapt, and improve. Every commercial pilot now trained on the A330 learns from the data recorded that night. How a simple vibration in a pipe nearly cost hundreds of lives, and how two pilots, relying only on experience and instinct, turned the world's most advanced airliner into a silent glider and brought everyone home. The ocean beneath them remains the same: vast, cold, and unforgiving. But because of that flight, the skies above it became safer. When the world first heard of Air Transat Flight 236, the headlines focused on a single astonishing fact: an Airbus A330 had glided more than 75 nautical miles without power and landed safely. But behind the dramatic headline was a deeper story, one that forever changed how aviation thinks about failure, decision-making, and survival. The night the sky went silent. At 39,000 feet over the Atlantic, technology, logic, and human instinct collided. The A330, one of the most advanced aircraft of its era, became powerless not because of one massive failure, but because of a chain of small errors. A misaligned tube, a missed checklist, and a misunderstanding of what the instruments were truly saying. It was the kind of scenario no simulator could replicate exactly, where every warning, every number, and every decision blurred into uncertainty. Yet in that silence, when both engines flamed out and the sea waited below, training and composure prevailed. Captain Robert Pish and First Officer Dirk de Jager demonstrated the essence of professional aviation: to stay calm, to analyze, and to act. There was no miracle, no luck in the mathematical sense. Only skill, precision, and the unrelenting will to fight gravity for as long as possible. The aircraft touched down at lodges with no thrust, no hydraulics, and almost no fuel, an outcome that remains one of aviation's most improbable successes. A symbol of human and machine. The incident became more than a survival story. It became a mirror showing how complex systems rely not only on flawless machinery, but on human judgment to interpret them. Technology can warn, calculate, and advise, but it cannot reason. The pilots of Flight 236 did what humans do best under pressure. They made decisions, sometimes imperfect, but grounded in experience and intuition. In that sense, the story of Flight 236 reaffirmed an uncomfortable truth in modern aviation. The greatest safety feature on any airplane is still the crew sitting at the controls. Echoes in the industry. Every major airline and flight academy now teaches this event. It's referenced in courses on human factors, fuel management, and emergency handling. Simulator scenarios based on Flight 236 train new pilots to challenge assumptions, to question automation, and to think beyond procedures when the unexpected occurs. What once nearly ended in tragedy now serves as a foundation for safer skies. Each generation of pilots learns that even in the most advanced aircraft, vigilance, skepticism, and teamwork remain irreplaceable. The legacy of the crew. Both Pish and de Jager later returned to commercial flying. For years after, passengers who recognized their names would sometimes thank them personally, not just for saving Flight 236, but for proving what professionalism under pressure can accomplish. When asked in an interview what went through his mind as the engines died, Pish answered quietly, "It wasn't fear, it was focus. We had work to do." That response summed up the defining quality of the event, the unwavering discipline to keep flying, even when flight itself seemed impossible. The two men never saw themselves as heroes. "We did our job," de Jager said simply. And the airplane did its part. A lasting impact. 2 decades later, the lessons of that night remain clear. Every emergency checklist, every flight management algorithm, every training syllabus, all carry a trace of Flight 230 SIX's data and its outcomes. It redefined how the aviation world understands the limits of automation and the power of human resilience. The flight also served as a quiet reminder to passengers. When the cabin lights dim, when the aircraft hums through the dark at cruising altitude, countless layers of engineering, training, and vigilance keep it moving safely across the sky. Flight 236 proved that even when those layers fail, skill and composure can still bring everyone home. Epilogue. In aviation museums and documentaries, Flight 236 is often described as the night the Atlantic almost claimed another jet. But it didn't. Instead, it became a story of endurance, of 2 pilots who refused to surrender to the silence, and of an aircraft that glided farther than any airliner ever had. As dawn broke over the Azores on August 24, 2001, the passengers stood barefoot on the runway, wrapped in blankets, staring at the silent A330 that had carried them through the impossible. That image, an airliner resting in the soft light of morning, every soul aboard alive, remains one of the most powerful in aviation history, because sometimes survival itself becomes the lesson.